There were few things more dangerous than boredom on the Oregon Trail. It was not a trail for the faint of heart, but it was also not a trail for those with short attention spans. In the 1840s, thousands of Americans left their homes to trek across an unsettled continent in search of new lives in the burgeoning settlements of the Pacific Northwest. What they found on the Oregon Trail was a lot of hard work, hardship, and death. But along with all that danger, there was something else, mind-numbing boredom. While the Oregon Trail is often remembered for its drama, wild storms, deadly illnesses, and tragic losses, the truth is, for most days, nothing really happened. No disasters, no river crossings, no bandits or bears. Just the same dirt roads stretching for miles and miles and miles. And if you're thinking that sounds relaxing, maybe even peaceful, let's look again. Because this was a kind of exhaustion that crept in slowly and quietly, day after day. Imagine waking up in the same clothes you've worn for weeks. You stretch your back, stiff from a wagon floor, eat the same dry biscuit, and begin walking. Ahead of you, a slow-moving line of wagons. Beside you, grass. Behind you, dust. This is what most days looked like on the Oregon Trail, endless repetition. And it wasn't just the landscape that was unchanging. Each day began and ended with the same basic tasks. Waking up, eating breakfast, chores, walking, setting up camp, eating dinner, chores, sleeping. There was little time for entertainment, and most travelers didn't have much to entertain themselves with anyway. They had come to the trail with high hopes for the future, not with a deck of cards or a loot. And so travelers were stuck in a world of dust, grass, and dirt roads. And sometimes that world got pretty small. The typical wagon train might consist of around 100 wagons, carrying between 500 and 1,000 people. For those keeping count, that's about 2 full days of walking just to get away from everyone. So travelers couldn't escape into the wilderness. They couldn't hide away on a river bank or climb a mountain peak. To get off by themselves, they had to keep moving forward. So it was hard to break out of the routine of the trail. Days blurred together. The sun seemed to rise and set at the same time each day, and the temperature never changed. The air was always hot, the nights always cold. Soon, travelers lost track of time and days turned into weeks, and that's when cabin fever hit. In the modern age, we know that being stuck inside for too long can be mentally draining. Some of us might get a little stir-crazy after a week without leaving the house. After months on the trail, everyone was stir-crazy. All that pent-up energy from the repetitive routine finally snapped. And travelers lashed out at one another. Tempers flared over minor disputes. Petty arguments became shouting matches. Fights broke out over who would take charge of the oxen or where the wagons should stop for the night. It was enough to make any pioneer long for the comfort of home, except they knew that home was still months away. The only thing they could do was push forward and hope that eventually, soon, something would happen to break the monotony. Sometimes something did. Travelers might spot a deer, maybe hear a hawk cry or see a wild horse gallop across the plains. But even these moments of excitement were fleeting. There was no way to interact with these animals. They were just a brief distraction from the constant drone of the trail. Travelers did their best to keep busy. When they weren't walking, some mended clothes or sharpened tools. Others whittled pieces of wood or carved toys for the children. Some read books aloud to the group, while others traded stories of the life they'd left behind. At night, after the campfire died down and the group prepared to sleep, the darkness was alive with sound. Travelers told ghost stories to keep the darkness at bay. They sang songs to pass the time, and occasionally someone would pull out a fiddle and dance tunes under the stars. But even these nighttime diversions could shake the feeling of dread that came with the endless days on the trail. As summer turned into fall, the weather began to change. Storms rolled through the plains, turning the ground into a sea of mud. The wind shifted and brought the first crisp chill of autumn. But even the changing seasons break the monotony. Travelers pressed on, eager to put as many miles between them and the United States as possible. By the time winter arrived, most had forgotten what a variety of scenery looked like. When they rounded a bend in the trail and saw, once again, just dirt, grass, and wagons, it was almost too much to bear. Some travelers tried to find distractions on the trail itself. Hunting was popular, though most hunters didn't stick to game. Along the Oregon Trail, travelers hunted anything that moved, including stray dogs, cats, and even oxen. Occasionally, they caught a wild horse or a burros, too. That was a special treat since neither animal had been domesticated yet. Some groups tried racing their wagons against other teams, while others organized mock cattle drives, rounding up stray oxen and herding them back to the main herd. Few travelers kept journals of their trip, writing down the events of each day, the number of miles walked, and their emotions. Most didn't last long with their writing because everything was the same every day, so why write it down? It's hard for us to imagine today, but for most of human history, life wasn't filled with distractions. People didn't have smartphones or TVS or streaming services. Even things like cars, trains, and planes were rare. And for the people traveling the Oregon Trail, that meant that there was very little to break up the monotony of everyday life. There were no distractions on the trail either. So when pioneers grew tired of the endless plains, they didn't have anywhere to go. They couldn't drive to the movies or pop open a bag of microwave popcorn. They couldn't hop on a plane to visit a friend or watch a streaming service while lying on a couch. They couldn't even drive into town and buy a video game. They were stuck on the trail with nothing to do but walk and wait. So now you know why pioneers on the Oregon Trail sometimes snapped. The landscape didn't offer much to distract them, and they couldn't even escape into the simple pleasures of reading or gaming. All they had was each other, and eventually, they wore thin on each other's nerves. But it's important to remember that while some people snapped, others made it all the way to Oregon and started new lives. In the mid-1800s, thousands of people decided that a life on the Oregon Trail was better than the life they had back east. Maybe you think that's crazy, but for people living in poverty or religious persecution, it might have seemed like the only option. And while the journey west was terrifying, fraught with danger, and yes, boring, it was also hopeful. Every mile brought them closer to freedom and a chance at a new life. And that hope carried them all the way to the Pacific. For people on the Oregon Trail, the end of the journey was the reward for enduring months of dangerous travel and deadly diseases. The final push was hard, but seeing the Pacific Ocean at the end of the trail made all those months worthwhile. Learn more about what life was like for the first settlers of Oregon. See how the beavers shaped American history, or find out what happened at the Whitman Massacre. When my wife told me she was pregnant, we were ecstatic. I couldn't wait to be a dad, and neither could she. We started planning for the baby right away, getting the nursery ready and buying all the essentials. But then something unexpected happened. My wife lost her job, and it seemed like everything was falling apart. We were worried about how we were going to make ends meet and provide for our baby. But despite the uncertainty, one thing was clear: we were going to have a baby. That's when we made the decision to pack up and start walking across the country. We were determined to make it work and prove that we could do anything if we set our minds to it. As we embarked on our journey, we had no idea what challenges we would face along the way. But we knew that we had each other and our unborn child to keep us going. From Missouri to Oregon, that's over 2,000 miles, and it could take 5 to 6 months. Now picture doing the same thing for half a year. Wake up, walk, eat, camp, sleep, repeat, over and over. A mile felt like a marathon. It was hard, it was hot, and there was a lot of screaming. But we kept going. We had to. Our baby depended on us. But this story is not just about the physical journey. It's also about the emotional roller coaster we went through. The mental health aspect of long-distance walking is something not many people talk about. The constant stress and pressure to keep moving can be overwhelming at times. There were moments when we felt like giving up, but we knew that we couldn't. Not only did we have each other, but we also had our unborn child to think about. As we walked, we began to feel the weight of our journey, both physically and emotionally. The scorching sun beat down on us as we walked from state to state. Each step we took brought us closer to our destination, but it also took a toll on our bodies. We pushed through the pain and exhaustion, knowing that we were creating memories that would last a lifetime. I remember there were days when my feet would bleed and my body would ache, but I couldn't stop. Not only did I have my wife to think about, but I also had the promise of a new life growing inside of me. That's why I kept going. Every blister, every cut, and every bruise became a badge of honor, a reminder of my strength and determination. The journey was not just about reaching the end point. It was about the personal growth and transformation that occurred along the way. Through the challenges we faced, we discovered a strength and resilience that we never knew we had. It was a journey of self-discovery and empowerment that we will never forget. Now let's talk about food. When you walk that much, you need to eat a lot. Usually, we ate breakfast at around 7 a.m., which consisted of oatmeal with nuts and dried fruit. This gave us the energy we needed to start our day. Then around noon, we would stop for lunch and eat something light like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. In the evening, we would cook up a hearty dinner like pasta or rice and beans to keep our strength up. It was important for us to stay hydrated, so we carried water with us and made sure to drink plenty of it throughout the day. One of the toughest parts of our journey was dealing with the mental health aspects of long-distance walking. The constant stress and pressure to keep moving can be overwhelming at times. There were moments when we felt like giving up, but we knew that we couldn't. It was during these moments that we really had to rely on each other for support. We talked to each other, shared our feelings, and encouraged each other to keep going. We also tried to focus on the positive aspects of our journey, like the beautiful scenery and the kindness of strangers who offered us food and water along the way. Despite the challenges, we knew that we had each other and our unborn child to keep us going. Another tough part of our journey was dealing with the physical toll that long-distance walking can take on your body. The constant strain on our feet, legs, and backs was excruciating at times. But we pushed through the pain and exhaustion, knowing that we were creating memories that would last a lifetime. We took breaks when we needed them and listened to our bodies. But we also knew that we had to keep moving forward. Looking back on our journey now, I am filled with a sense of pride and accomplishment. We did it. We walked across the country and welcomed our baby into a world that was ready for him because we had prepared as best we could for his arrival. The challenges we faced along the way made us stronger and more resilient than we ever imagined. It was hard, it was hot, and there was a lot of screaming. But we kept going. We had to. Our baby depended on us. It was a wild ride, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. And now here's a little secret. The whole time we were walking, we were recording a video. We wanted to capture every moment of the journey, every blister, every cut, every bruise, even the good days. We knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and we wanted to remember it forever. So we started filming a video diary, talking into the camera about our experiences, our thoughts, and our feelings. We showed the blisters, the bloody toes, the struggles, the exhaustion, tears, fears, and the hopes. It was raw, unfiltered, and free. But here's the thing, we never planned on sharing it with anyone else. It was just for us, our little secret, our way of documenting this crazy adventure we were on. But then something amazing happened. Other people started watching our video and they loved it. They were inspired by our story and wanted to know more. So we decided to share our video with the world. We posted it online, and within a few weeks, we had thousands of views. People from all over the country were watching our video and leaving comments and messages of support. It was surreal. We had never done anything like this before, and we had no idea what to expect. But the response was incredible. People were moved by our story and our video. They saw themselves in our struggles, and they cheered us on. It was a feeling like no other. Through our video, we were able to connect with people who were going through similar challenges, and we were able to inspire others who were on their own journeys. It was amazing to see the impact that our video had on people's lives. Now, I want you to know that we are not superheroes. We are just ordinary people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. But if we can do it, then so can you. Whatever challenges you're facing right now, whatever seems impossible, don't give up. Keep moving forward. You never know what you're capable of until you try. And hey, if you ever need some inspiration, just watch our video. It'll remind you that anything is possible if you set your mind to it. Thank you for listening to our story. We hope that it has inspired you to chase your dreams and never give up, no matter how tough things get. Remember, the journey is just as important as the destination, and every step you take brings you closer to your goals. Thanks for watching. A fly that buzzed insistently in your ear, the constant crunch of gravel underfoot, the dust that swirled and stung your eyes. These were some of the small indignities that nagged at travelers along the Oregon Trail, a trek that was already excruciatingly tedious. For 4,000 pioneers in 1848, this journey would become even more hellish thanks to a series of devastating floods that washed out bridges, destroyed supply depots, and forced travelers to abandon their wagons and belongings and walk. Floods, fires, and disease killed many, but for those who survived, the long, hot summer of 1848 became the stuff of nightmares. The year before, 1847, had been an unseasonably cold and wet one, which threatened to stall the massive migration west. So in 1848, when spring arrived with unusually high temperatures, everyone assumed that it would be a good thing for travel. But by May, the temperature was already 100 degrees. And by July, flooding rains turned the trail into a sloppy mess. By August, 800 immigrants were stuck in a place called Fort Laramie, waiting for the water to recede. 2 months later, they were still waiting. In frustration, many decided to head home. Others pressed on, hoping that conditions would improve. They didn't. Over the next 2 years, storms, flooding, heat, and disease would make the Oregon Trail one of the most deadly routes in American history. But let's take a step back. Before we get to the nightmarish year of 1848, it's important to understand how the Oregon Trail got so crowded in the first place. In the early 19th century, Americans had a hankering for Oregon country, a vast territory claimed by Britain and Spain that encompassed present-day Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Montana and Wyoming. After winning independence from the Dutch in 1846, Americans began pushing further into Oregon country, attracted by the seemingly endless amounts of fur-bearing animals, fertile land, and the promise of adventure. Soon enough, thousands of settlers had made their way to the Willamette Valley, which today is home to Portland. But they quickly encountered the problem of how to get there. The nearest seaport to the Willamette Valley was San Francisco, more than 2,000 miles away. Traveling between the two involved a harrowing journey over the Rocky Mountains. So in 1841, American John Gant, a former mountain man, led a party to find a route across the continent. He followed the winding path of a river system eventually named the Oregon Trail after its discovery. Starting from Missouri, the trail followed the North Platte River through present-day Nebraska and Wyoming before heading up to the Columbia River and finally reaching the Willamette Valley. The following year, nearly 1,000 immigrants traveled the trail, and each year thereafter, more and more people headed west. By 1848, when the overcrowding and flooding occurred, roughly 30,000 pioneers had made the journey, while many others returned east again. When the weather was bad, like it had been in 1847, travelers could easily spend 6 months or longer on the trail, often facing shortages of food and fuel. Such was the case in 1847, when the slow start to the migration season and a series of heavy snows trapped travelers in winter camps for months. To stave off starvation, families were forced to kill and eat their oxen, then fashion new teams from the hides. While others tried hunting buffalo, the meat of which was so tough and stringy that it earned it the nickname, the poor man's meat. For many, it was still better than nothing. There were also times when the river rose so high that immigrants had to abandon their wagons and belongings and walk until the water receded. But these were exceptions. For the most part, 1847 was not terrible. So when 1848 rolled around and the temperature started to rise, everyone assumed it was going to be a good year. But within weeks, the rivers began to swell. The party that had set out from Missouri in April found themselves snowbound near Fort Laramie in early May. Within a few days, the snow melted, sending torrents of water onto the already saturated ground. By the end of May, the North Platte River had risen 6 feet. Many of the travelers abandoned their wagons and trudged knee-deep through the water. At the same time, word spread that the recently built Fort Boise, which was supposed to serve as a supply depot for immigrants traveling the Oregon Trail, had been completely destroyed in a flood. It was a disaster that would have ripple effects for hundreds of miles. See, the fort had been constructed in the summer of 1847 just for such emergencies. Built by the American Fur Company and overseen by a man named Nathaniel J. Wyatt, the fort was designed to supply immigrants who might run low on food and fuel during their travels. Each immigrant family was required to purchase a certificate for $20, which they would turn in at the fort in exchange for provisions. Unfortunately, a freak flood washed the entire thing away. As a result, any immigrant who hadn't yet reached Fort Boise would have to carry enough food and supplies to last them the entire trip. When the immigrants did reach Oregon, they learned that Fort Vancouver, another supply depot, had suffered the same fate. So the travelers who had made it across the continent found no relief. The combination of a shortage of supplies, rising temperatures, and blistering sun made the journey miserable. In August, the temperature rose to 115 degrees. Oxen dropped like flies. With no shade and little breeze, travelers huddled in the wagon beds at night to stay cool. One traveler described the experience as follows. We are parched with thirst, and the tongue becomes so swollen with eating salt that it feels as though it would fill the mouth. Sleep is impossible during the day. Our cattle die around us, and we ourselves feel as though we must die also. So by September, when the travelers finally arrived in the Willamette Valley, they were greeted as heroes. The hardships of the journey were behind them, and the abundance of Oregon awaited. But things took a dark turn when the happy pioneers discovered that most of the valley was already occupied by people who had made the journey the year before. Most of them had struggled through similar hardships and now lived in sturdy houses with well-stocked pantries. Though disappointed, most immigrants continued on to the Columbia River and the northern Willamette Valley, where they established new settlements. And for a few years, life was good, but trouble was brewing. Disease returned in 1849, killing dozens. The next year, more than 1,000 immigrants died on the Oregon Trail. Many of the deaths were caused by cholera, a bacterial infection spread by contaminated water. But it wasn't the only killer. Malaria, typhoid fever, and even the plague reared their ugly heads. The lack of proper burial grounds meant that the dead were often left to rot, further spreading disease among the living. The following year, 1851, saw fewer deaths, but the floods returned. And in 1852, cholera killed nearly 100 people in Oregon City alone. By 1853, the Oregon Trail had taken so many lives that it had earned the nickname, the Great Road of Death. People were still making the journey, but now they were doing it by train. Today, visitors can explore the Oregon Trail for themselves via a website run by the U.S. National Park Service. But if you're planning to use it to virtually retrace the steps of these poor, tired, starving travelers, don't. Instead, use it to learn about the history of the West Coast and the Oregon Trail specifically. To learn more about the history of the Oregon Trail and the Lewis and Clark expedition that preceded it, check out the resources. Then watch this video to find out why pioneers really left the United States. The constant clop of oxen hooves, the repetitive crunch of boots on dry grass. Even the wind could become unbearable, the way it never stopped, the way it pulled at your hair, your bonnet, your nerves. There's a kind of madness that grows not in chaos, but in monotony. And on the Oregon Trail, monotony was your most faithful companion. When you think of life on the Oregon Trail, you probably imagine excitement, danger, adventure. You may picture covered wagons racing across the Great Plains, folks shooting buffalo off the back of their wagons, Native Americans attacking. But I'm here to tell you about something different, the quiet horrors of the trail. This is the story of something far less dramatic, yet more pervasive than any danger on the trail, boredom. You might think that boredom can't be all that bad. We all get bored sometimes. It's an annoyance, an inconvenience. Sure, if you're really bored, you could always read a book or take up knitting. But for the travelers on the Oregon Trail, boredom wasn't something they could just knit away. It was an ever-present threat, a potential source of great suffering. People today are used to having distractions. When we're stuck somewhere or waiting for something, we pull out our phones and check our social media feeds, or we start scrolling through Amazon listings. Or maybe we just start mindlessly swiping on TikTok until our eyes fall out. Back on the trail, those options didn't exist. So when people got bored, there weren't many healthy outlets for that energy. Sometimes they fought. There was no privacy. Wagons were shared. Tents were rare. You slept beside your siblings, your parents, your neighbors. There was no real privacy. Not to think, not to cry, not to be alone. Families on the trail tried to maintain some semblance of privacy with curtains or wagon covers, but these didn't block sound very well, and they couldn't stop the gossip. If you wanted to do anything remotely private, you basically had to make a run for it into the prairie. So, say you needed to, I don't know, pee behind a tree. It wasn't like you could duck into the bushes and do your business without everyone in your camp knowing what you were up to. See, there were two problems with relieving yourself in the woods. First, it took a lot of courage to wander off by yourself into the wilderness. There were predators out there, mountain lions, bears, wolves, other people. And even if you managed to survive your trip to the bathroom, you couldn't just relieve yourself wherever you wanted to. The land was already occupied. Native Americans lived on this land. They had villages and crops and families, and they didn't want you crapping all over their territory. Most travelers knew this and would take steps to avoid leaving human excrement on the land. For example, they might bury their business, or maybe find a rock to squat on so that their backside wouldn't come into contact with the ground. But you can bet that wherever you chose to go, word would get back to your camp about how long you were gone, where you went, and what exactly you did while you were gone. You want to pray in silence? Good luck. Say you wanted to pray. That seemed like it should be a private matter, right? Well, for one thing, most people on the trail didn't have much use for praying. They were traveling to Oregon to escape the puritanical rule of Massachusetts, where prayer was basically mandatory. Or maybe you were an American Indian who was being forcibly relocated, and you wanted to pray to the Great Spirit that you would one day be able to return home. Even so, you still had to be careful, because even the most private of prayers could be interrupted. A mother praying for her sick child could easily be overheard. And if she prayed long enough, someone would eventually ask her, "Why are you praying so hard?" And then she'd have to explain that her child was running a fever and possibly hallucinating from dehydration. And Then someone else would say, "Oh, my child had a fever once. What you need to do is put leeches on him." Or maybe you were a man wanting to pray for your wife who had miscarried on the trail. Or maybe you just wanted to pray for a nice cool breeze to blow through camp. Whatever your reason, you probably shouldn't have done it in front of your neighbor. People on the trail weren't keen on hearing about other people's misfortunes. And if you were praying for something as selfish as cooler weather, well, that would only invite mockery. After all, complaining about the heat or cold was considered ungrateful. What right did you have to complain when so many people were dying? Right. Want to grieve quietly? You'd still need to make dinner? In 1849, a cholera epidemic swept through the Oregon Territory. The disease killed hundreds of pioneers, and in some camps, no one was spared. A father, mother, son, and daughter could be wiped out in a day. When someone died, they were quickly buried. Usually, a body was placed in a coffin and lowered into a grave the same day it was discovered. There was no time to wait for a body to decay. There was no time to grieve, and there was definitely no time to mope around and feel sorry for yourself. Someone had to cook dinner and someone had to watch the children. So while your neighbors might not have wanted to hear about your misfortunes or listen to your prayers, they would be eager to hear about theirs. It was considered good manners to inform your closest neighbors about your tragedies. You'd probably want to know, right? Also, this was important for keeping the group safe. If a family was wiped out by cholera, it was helpful for others to know so that they could avoid eating the infected food. But this obligation to share your misery meant that you couldn't really have any private grief. Your tragedy became everyone's tragedy. You couldn't curl up in a corner and cry. You had to make dinner. You had to watch the children. You had to keep moving forward. Want to just sit and be still? There was no time. When you're sitting still today, chances are you're doing something. You might be reading or writing or typing or watching. But on the trail, if you weren't participating in the tasks required to keep the wagon trained, you were basically useless. And people were too busy trying to survive to have anyone just sitting around doing nothing. Men were expected to drive the oxen and take care of the animals. They also had to build shelters and fix equipment. Women cooked meals, mended clothing, took care of the children, and collected firewood. Children were expected to help however they could. Basically, there was no such thing as downtime on the trail. And it wasn't just work that filled every waking moment. You also had to be constantly vigilant. Life on the trail was dangerous. Travelers had to worry about sickness, injury, animal attacks, being stranded on the prairie, running out of supplies, finding wood, finding water, making sure the wagon train kept moving. This constant tension meant that people couldn't really relax, even if they wanted to, even if they had the time. If you fell asleep on the job, you could be putting yourself and your entire company at risk. There were moments when travelers could take a breather, like when they reached a river crossing and the whole company had to team up to get everyone and everything across safely. But even then, there was little opportunity to just enjoy the scenery or relax and calm down. Distractions were limited. Today, we have podcasts, music, social media, video calls, audio books, entertainment on demand. On the trail, you had your thoughts, maybe a book if you had the luxury to carry them. Some folks brought violins or harmonicas. Others sang songs to pass the time. But after hearing the same songs over and over again for months, that could get pretty boring, too. Imagine spending a couple of months listening to the same songs over and over again. Every night when the campfire was going, people would sing songs. They sang songs about home. They sang songs about religion. They sang songs about the journey itself. And sometimes they sang songs about the disasters that befell them on the journey. Imagine hearing the same songs over and over again, the same stories told over and over again, the same jokes told over and over again. Imagine never getting a break from the people in your group, even in the privacy of your own head. Eventually, you would go crazy, and that's what made the rare distractions that much more precious. When someone in the group told a particularly interesting story or introduced a new song, everyone would listen intently. When travelers finally reached Oregon, they would likely be greeted by a newspaper telling them about the gold rush in California, sparking a whole new set of conversations and distractions to fill the long, lonely hours on the trail. There was no escape. On the Oregon Trail, boredom wasn't just a nuisance. It was a constant threat, but in a strange way, boredom could actually be a relief. At least it gave people something familiar to talk about. When you're bored, you can share your boredom. You can complain about how boring things are, and that can give you something to focus on besides your fear of death. And that was a real blessing on the Oregon Trail. Every day on the Oregon Trail was pretty much the same. Wake up, tend to camp chores, hit the trail, walk until sundown, set up camp, eat dinner, huddle around the campfire, go to bed. But most days, your mind did the work. And for many, it wandered into places they didn't expect. Fears, regrets, memories, doubts. As the wagons creaked forward, inner voices grew louder. Some kept journals. One of the only emotional outlets many pioneers had was a journal. And thousands of these trail journals survive today, filled with the quiet thoughts of ordinary people crossing a brutal, beautiful continent. Some entries are cheerful, others are grim. Many are painfully mundane. Walked 20 miles today, fixed the axle again, ate cold beans, and yet, there's something soothing in that simplicity. Even the most boring details offered pioneers control, a sense of time, a record of living. In a world where everything felt uncertain, writing it down gave it meaning. Small joys became big events. Every once in a while, something would break the monotony. A new wildflower in bloom, a rabbit darting from the brush. A moment of silence broken by laughter. The party continued on, following the Arkansas River toward its confluence with the Colorado. The river journey had been long, fraught with peril, but undeniably majestic. And now the travelers were about to see the source of that majesty. As the Arkansas emptied into the Colorado, the view took their breath away. Here, at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, the great river was born. It snaked through the valleys below them, glittering and teeming with life. The spirit of the Rockies seemed to have been poured into its waters, which rushed and tumbled over rocks and pebbles, creating an ever-changing melody of sound. For the travelers, crest of the ridge, the sight before them was both terrifying and inspiring. Below, the Arkansas and Colorado flowed side by side, disappearing into a vast and mysterious canyon. This was the beginning of the end of their journey. As they began their descent into the canyon lands, they knew they were entering the final leg of their travels. And with each step, the reality of their fate pressed down on them like a physical weight. The vastness of the canyon, its sheer immensity, served as a constant reminder of their own fragility. The travelers were mere specks of dust in the face of such grandeur. The isolation was also palpable. The canyon walls rose high above them, creating a sense of enclosure that was both comforting and unnerving. They were protected from the outside world, yes, but they were also utterly alone. This physical separation brought a myriad of emotions to the surface. Fear, excitement, wonder, anxiety. It was a mixture that made the journey all the more intense, forging a bond among the travelers that was as strong as it was complex. The descent into the canyon was not just a geographical one, it was an emotional journey as well. The travelers pushed on, driven by the promise of a new life in the West, but the road was long and arduous. The terrain was rough and the pace was slow. Days turned into weeks and the travelers' spirits began to flag. But then, as if by magic, the landscape shifted. The harsh beauty of the Rockies gave way to rolling hills and verdant valleys. The air was sweeter here, the light more gentle. It was as if the journey itself had orchestrated this transformation, leading them from hardship to hope, from struggle to serenity. The travelers could hardly believe their eyes. Could this be the Oregon they had dreamed of? Was the hardship finally giving way to the promise of a better life? Or was this just another trick of the trail, another tease before the next wave of adversity crashed upon them? Both flickered in their chests, fragile as a butterfly's wing, yet tenacious as a weed pushing through concrete. They pressed on, clinging to this newfound optimism as their wagons rumbled over the hills and valleys of the Great Plains. The travelers had heard tales of these lands, of buffalo herds so vast they blotted out the sun and skies so clear they sparkled with stars. But nothing had prepared them for the reality of it. The endless horizon, the wind whispering secrets through the grasses, the symphony of bird songs echoing across the prairie. It was a world away from the rugged mountains they had just left behind. The open range stretched before them, seemingly endless, a sea of waving grass as far as the eye could see. It was a landscape that inspired awe and a strange sense of freedom. The travelers felt as though they were on the edge of the world, as though the very spirit of the Great Plains was out there on the horizon, beckoning them forward. As they followed the rutted tracks of the pioneers before them, each mile brought new wonders. The occasional deer or antelope that leapt across their path, the hawks circling high overhead, the play of sunlight and shadow across the undulating land. It was a ballet of nature, a performance that unfolded daily in a panorama of color and movement. And the travelers were simply spectators, humbled and awestruck by the drama of the wild frontier. Yet, even as they reveled in the grandeur of the plains, part of them remained there, for they knew that this untamed wilderness held dangers as well as delights. Rattlesnakes hidden in the tall grass, buffalo stampeding across their path, nights so cold they could freeze a man solid. The Great Plains were a land of extremes, of scorching summers and biting winters, of sudden storms and relentless droughts. They were in the heart of the continent, far from the comforts of civilization, at the mercy of the elements and the creatures of the wild. Yet, despite the dangers, the travelers couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration. They were experiencing something truly wild, something that touched their souls and stirred their spirits. They were alive in a way they had never been before, keenly aware of every sensation, every sight, every sound, every smell. The journey was taking them deeper into the heart of the continent, and in doing so, it was taking them deeper into themselves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, the travelers huddled around their campfire. The sky blazed with colors they had never seen before, crimson and gold, violet and rose. It was as if the prairie itself was putting on a grand finale for their benefit. The campfire crackled merrily, its flames dancing in the gathering darkness. Shadows flickered, and the travelers leaned closer, mesmerized by the play of light and dark. Above them, the stars began to appear, pinpricks of light on a vast black cloth. And then there were so many, more than they had ever seen in the skies above their eastern homes. It was as if the prairie was reaching up to the heavens and drawing constellations across the night. The travelers sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The immensity of the sky, the solitude of the plains, the camaraderie of the campfire, it all pressed upon them, overwhelming them with a sense of the grand spectacle of life, death, and rebirth. For a moment, the hardships of the journey, the aching muscles, the gnawing hunger, all of it receded into the background. There was only the fire, stars, and the whisper of the wind through the grass. It was a moment of pure being, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, beauty could be found. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope could shine through. And with that, they slept under the watchful gaze of a million stars, dreaming dreams as vast and unending as the plains themselves. They were sustained by the stories told by the elders, by the songs that spoke of a land flowing with milk and honey. This Oregon promised a haven from the troubles they had known back east, a place where they could start anew. But how much longer would this hope sustain them? How much longer could they endure the hardships of the trail, the constant threat of starvation, disease, and the despair of abandonment? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as they trudged wearily along the dusty path. Each step was a testament to their resilience, each sunrise a victory over despair. But the land seemed to stretch on forever, and the finish line of their dreams remained tantalizingly out of reach. Yet still they pressed on, driven by the vision of a better life, sustained by the stories of a land that beckoned them forward. Click here to watch one of these videos and let us know in the comments what you think life would have been like for a pioneer child on the Oregon Trail. The same sun rose and set over the endless plain. Each morning we woke with the oxen, made camp chores, and then set off toward the west. Most days we walked behind our wagons in a loose sled. We followed trails, sometimes blazed by other pioneers, sometimes no more than animal tracks or the dimpled wheel ruts of a wagon that had passed long ago. Some days another wagon train would pass. People exchanged news, traded recipes, shared gossip. A child's birthday might call for a rare treat, maybe preserved fruit, if any remained. The appearance of a distant mountain stirred emotions. And on Sundays, if the weather held, families paused to rest. They prayed, they washed, they sat and looked at the sky. In a life full of repetition, these brief breaks felt profound. Every night when the firelight flickered and died and the moon rode high overhead, we told stories. In the dark, I listened to tales of adventure and daring, of hardships endured and victories won. When Pa told stories, his voice would grow strong and vibrant, alive with humor and pathos. Sometimes he would sing. The songs he sang were old, older than I was, and they spoke of a life I could scarcely imagine, of rolling hills and thatched cottages under skies as gray and brooding as a leaden sea. I wanted to ask him where those songs came from, but I knew the question would be met with a gruff, "Why do you want to know?" So I never asked. Instead, I sat close to the fire and drank in his words. And with each new sunset, the past grew vaster, the future more uncertain. The trip across the plains was not a vacation. No one on the Oregon Trail expected it to be. But even so, there were moments when the beauty of the journey stole our breath. It happened most often when we crested a rise and the wind snatched away the thin veil of dust that hung between us and the world. Then we would see nothing but green, a sea of emeralds stretching to the horizon. Or the prairie would be aflame with wildflowers, their colors shifting from day to day like the panels of a painter's palette. I remember, too, the startling clarity of the night sky. It seemed to stretch down to earth, touching us with its immensity. We were very small on that trail, smaller even than the jackrabbits that flashed across our path. And I suppose it was this humility that made the hardships bearable. The wind that buffeted us also nourished the prairie. The rain that drenched us also watered the growing things. The sun that beat down on our heads provided the energy that pushed us on. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was too small or insignificant to have a purpose. I think that if we had stopped to consider it, we would have been overwhelmed, but we did not stop. We went forward day by day, week by week, month by month, sustained by a vision that flickered on the horizon like a candle in the wind. By the time we reached the halfway point of our journey, my legs were scratched and scuffed, and my shoulders chafed and ached. My hands were blistered and raw. The leather of my boots was thin in places, and my feet poked through to the rawhide beneath. At night, when the campfire died and the chill of the prairie night pressed in, Mama would take my boots and rub the rawhide solace with tallow. Then she would pull them on tight and tie the laces above my ankles. When she finished, my feet felt warm and snug inside the leather shoes, and I would forget my aches until the next day, until the sun beat down on my back and the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Then things began to change. The first sign was subtle. It happened in my dreams. I was walking behind the wagon train, as I always did, when suddenly the ground beneath me tilted. The wagons lurched, a cheer went up, and I awoke to the sound of Pa's voice. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Time to get up." But when I climbed out of the wagon bed and stumbled to the fire, the coffee pot was empty, the fire was cold, and no one else was awake except Mama, who sat up in her wagon bed sewing. "Where is everybody?" I asked. "They've gone on ahead," Mama said without looking up. "We're late, and I told them to get a good start today." I waited, but no one else emerged from the wagons. I went to the others, rousing them one by one. Soon we were all outside, but there was no cheer. No one even stretched or yawned. We just stood blinking in the morning light, our eyes not yet used to the brightness after days and weeks spent under the canvas. None of us spoke. There was no need. We all knew why we were here, why we had come. As we walked that day, I saw a wild look on many faces, hard and bright and filled with an unsettling eagerness. That evening, after the work was done and the children were tucked into their beds, I heard hushed voices under the stars. I lay awake listening. The adults talked in low tones about what they would do once they reached the end of the trail, about the fortunes they would make and the lives they would live. The wagons were only a few feet apart, but it seemed to me that an unbridgeable chasm yawned between the people inside. Each family huddled together, holding fast to their own hopes and dreams. For the first time since we had left Missouri, no one sang that night. By the time we reached the halfway point of our journey, my legs were scratched and scuffed, and my shoulders chafed and ached. My hands were blistered and raw. The leather of my boots was thin in places, and my feet poked through to the rawhide beneath. At night, when the campfire died and the chill of the prairie night pressed in, Mama would take my boots and rub the rawhide solace with tallow. Then she would pull them on tight and tie the laces above my ankles. When she finished, my feet felt warm and snug inside the leather shells, and I would forget my aches until the next day, till the sun beat down on my back and the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. But now the sun no longer brought just heat, it brought urgency. The days when we walked behind our wagons became fewer. More often we rode in the back of wagons, sitting on mounds of supplies that jostled with every bump in the road. Now we raced the sun, racing to get as far as we could before sundown, the anxiety in the air grew. Now the slightest latch meant a spill, a broken yoke went to repaired. A child wandered too far and had to be called back. Every moment was precious, every moment carried risk. A missed step could mean the difference between a fall and a stumble. A dropped axe could mean the difference between a notch and an arrow. We couldn't afford mistakes, not now, not when we were so close to the end. And then one morning, as we packed up again, someone let out a shout. Look, we all turned toward the point of his finger. And there in the distance, riding high above the plain, were the snow-capped peaks of the Cascade Mountains. All the way that day, we stared at those mountains, our eyes tracking their slow emergence from the haze, our hearts lifting at the sight. When we camped that night, we cooked a supper unlike any we'd had on the trail. After the dishes were done and the children were tucked into their beds, Ma and Pa joined the others around the fire. With their hands gnarled by work and etched by years of sun and wind, they reached out to touch the flames. As they watched the fire, I saw their faces soften, the lines around their eyes crinkling, not with sadness, but with something like peace. I don't remember what they said that night, but I remember what they didn't say. There was no talk of how soon we would reach the Willamette Valley, no mention of houses and farms and fences. In the silence between their words, I heard the quiet strength of their entrance, the fierce love they had for each other and for us. And in the flickering firelight, their faces seemed to glow with a strange radiance. I sat wrapped in my blankets, watching the fire, trying to absorb the quiet courage that emanated from them. We had come so far, and the journey had changed them. And I really knew now that they would shape me too, whether I wanted to be shaped or not. There were moments on that trail when I wanted to stop and explore the prairie, when I longed to lie on my back and watch the clouds drift by, when I wished for a butterfly to land on my fingertip or a rabbit to pause in its flight and let me pet its soft fur. But I didn't stop. I kept going, moving forward with the others, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because deep inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't the same girl who had climbed into that covered wagon 18 months earlier. Out here, something had been born, something fierce and resilient and free. And when I finally stepped off the trail and onto the banks of the Willamette, when I breathed the sweet air of home, it was that girl who stepped forward into the sunlight. Mental fatigue became physical. It cost lives. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you've been well. I thought today we'd take a trip to the Oregon Trail. I'll be your guide. It'll be a cinch. You're gonna love this. So, we're going back to the mid-1800s and we're headed west for Missouri. We will follow the Oregon Trail into what's now the Pacific Northwest. A rough journey of about 2,000 miles, and your experience is dependent upon which route you take and the year that you travel. The journey takes anywhere between 4 and 6 months. We're not gonna be traveling with a wagon train, not gonna be doing it the easy way. No, sir. We're gonna be hiking the whole way. About 15 miles per day sounds like a nice leisurely stroll, doesn't it? Well, that's what you would think, but your feet are gonna get sore, blistered, raw. You're gonna be exhausted by the time you reach camp each evening. So even though you're not traveling with an oxen team, you're still gonna be working all day. When you first set out on the trail, you're going to be excited. Your supplies are fresh, your spirits are high, and you're moving right along. But you're gonna start running low on food pretty quickly. Just 5 days into your journey, you're gonna start to feel hungry. And then a few days after that, you're gonna start eating beans. You're gonna be tired of beans before you even reach Independence Rock. You probably won't stay at Independence Rock very long, but if you did, you might check out the wares at the trading post, pick up some new supplies, but you're not gonna linger long. You're pressed for time. You need to get out of Independence Rock. And honestly, the trading post isn't that appealing. There's not much of a selection, and everything's expensive. But you may choose to stay an extra day or two and hunt some buffalo. Or maybe you'll stay longer because your oxen need a rest. Oh, wait, you're not bringing oxen. You're hiking. Well, then you better have another reason to stay. Perhaps someone got injured and needs more time to heal. Maybe you've run out of food and you need more time to hunt. Whatever the reason, you're staying another day, and you know what? In the morning, you're gonna wake up to a beautiful view, especially if you camped near the river. If you followed the Sweetwater route, you camped close to a river. And in the morning, you're gonna enjoy a good breakfast before you head out. It's been a while since you've had anything besides beans and hard bread. But you brought some luxuries with you, didn't you? You knew this would be a long journey, so you packed some coffee, sugar, flour, spices. Maybe you brought some eggs and milk powder. Maybe you're traveling with a cook. Or maybe you're a pretty good cook yourself. Either way, the food's gonna taste good, the coffee's gonna be hot, and you're ready for another day on the trail. But then you see a sign. You read it. It says, "Beware of robbers." Okay, you say to yourself, robbers, you say, like it's gonna make a difference. I don't have anything worth stealing, and most likely the robbers aren't looking for someone who walks behind an ox team. They're looking for large wagons carrying lots of goods. They're probably looking for travelers who look like they have money. You don't look like you have money. You probably don't have anything worth stealing. But even so, you should keep an eye out. You should be ready to defend yourself. You're armed, aren't you? You wouldn't be hiking the Oregon Trail without being armed. So you know how to shoot. You know how to use your knife. And you do your best best to protect yourself, but robbers, disease, and death can strike at any moment on the Oregon Trail. And the next thing you know, you're drifting to sleep. It costs lives. Boredom isn't just dull, it's draining. When you first set out on the Oregon Trail, you're excited. You know the journey will be long and difficult, but you have supplies and the promise of adventure ahead. Maybe you were born in the East Coast and you've always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean. You've heard stories about the great forests of the Northwest, and you've been dreaming about this trip for years. Maybe you're escaping something or someone. Either way, when the trip first begins, you're eager to start. You've got some company, too. Maybe you joined a wagon train for protection. Maybe you found a group of fellow travelers who started around the same time you did. And you've been following each other ever since. At least you're not alone. But then the landscape changes from farmland to desert to more farmland. And the people start talking about Fort Laramie. They talk about the trading post and how much they lines enjoy a resupply and a night away from their wagons. But for you, the excitement is starting to wear off. You're tired of the routine. Up before sunrise, work all day, eat, sleep, repeat. Today, you're not allowed to stop and smell the wildflowers. You're not allowed to sit and enjoy the sunset. You're not allowed to watch a buffalo stampede. Today, you're not even allowed to take pictures for your social media. You're not allowed to do anything besides hike 15 miles a day. You're not allowed to collect cool rocks, and the monotony drives you crazy. Today, you're not allowed to ask Siri for directions. You're not allowed to find service and call your mom. You're not allowed to send a text message. You're not allowed to check the weather. You're not allowed to order takeout. You're not allowed to stream your favorite show. You're not allowed to play games on your phone. You're not allowed to read your Kindle. You're not allowed to do anything. You're just not allowed to. And the worst part is you can't even complain about it. Because what you complain about the most these days, no one else cares. But back then, you couldn't even complain about your own misery. You'd have to find service and call your mom. You'd have to pull out a typewriter and write a letter. You'd have to walk to a trading post and buy paper and ink. And by then, you'd have to walk all the way home to deliver the letter yourself. And you can't do any of that. You're stuck on the trail. And the only option you have is to keep walking. Now, the isolation will drive you crazy. You want to see other people, but you're also tired of seeing the same faces every day. You're tired of listening to the same stories, tired of eating the same food, tired of the complaints. You're tired of hearing how much farther, over and over again. You're tired of answering how much farther. You're tired of it all. You're so tired of it all, you just want to quit. Tonight, you don't have to walk. Tonight, you don't have to stir the beams or fix the wheel or sleep on the dirt. Tonight, you can rest. You can listen to the quiet. You can let the trail fade away for now. Sleep well, traveler. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed our trip down memory lane. How much of the Oregon Trail do you remember? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. In 1848, a party of 62 travelers started down the Columbia River from Fort Vancouver. Their mission, reach the U.S. Army post at the Dalles City and resupply for the journey home. They figured they'd be there in 4 days. Only problem was, they hadn't reckoned on just how hungry travelers could be. In that time, they ate everything except spoiled barrels of pork. By the time they got to the Dalles City, they were so ravenous that men, women, and children fought over the scraps in those barrels. That desperate scene played out again and again as travelers struggled not only to put distance between themselves and the Independence Rock disaster, but also to stay alive. Along the way, the Oregon Trail was supposed to be a trail to the West Coast. Instead, it became a trail to starvation. Remember, you are in control of your wagon train. Hold up your hand if you want to stop and forage for berries or hunt some deer. Why are you doing that? Your oxen are starving, too. How much longer can you keep going? How many more days until winter? You've lost half your party to disease and death already. Are you sure you want to risk the rest? We know you do, but let's just make sure you're making the right call here. What would you do? Hunting along the way was risky, dangerous work. And foraging for berries and roots took time you didn't have. But not taking care of your oxen was even worse. See, your oxen were your lifeline. You could kill them for meat, but you needed them alive to pull your wagons. If you butchered too many, you'd be stuck when you needed to move again. There was no turning back. All you could do was push forward to the end of the trail, praying you and your party made it in time to plant crops before winter. Foraging along the trail wasn't easy, but hunting wild game can help sustain your party for longer. There were bison, deer, elk, antelope, rabbits, squirrels, even bears and mountain lions. But these animals were fast, wary, and sometimes mean. Don't get gored by an angry bull. Try to track a deer without being seen. Don't provoke a grizzly bear. Oh, wait, never mind. You provoked the grizzly bear. Run away. Leave the wagon train and forge ahead on foot. Leave the sick or elderly behind. Leave the dead. What choice did you have? People died anyway. Why let them die cold and alone on the trail when you could bury them with dignity? Women buried their babies with the meager rations that hadn't yet spoiled. Husbands buried wives who died from eating spoiled meat. Fathers watched their children frozen stiff in their sleep. Then they had to keep going. It was the only way. You buried them, said a prayer, maybe dug up a body the next day to move it to a safer place. In the spring, when the snows melted, people came across graves and the bodies were gone. The wolves got them, or maybe the coyotes or the birds. Some bones were picked clean and left in the sun, bleaching white, grinning skulls leering from the underbrush. When the wind hit, you hunkered down against the wagon wall. The wind tore across the plains. It howled through the valleys. It moaned like an animal in pain. Sometimes it shook your very bones. At times like those, you felt glad for the solid walls of your wagon, thankful for the companionship of others. You would huddle together, share stories and songs, but the wind still screamed outside. And sometimes the wind brought something worse than cold, snow, and loneliness. It carried the smell of death. You heard the coughs before you saw them. The coughs that ripped through the night, cracking some poor soul, burning deep in his chest. Then you saw them, the cholera train. They rode in the back of wagons now, the sickest of the sick, coughing blood, eyes blank, skin waxing. Sometimes a family would come upon them, stop and help. Sometimes people nursed the sick for days, hoping they would get better. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they died in the night and you found them cold in the morning. The wine would carry the smell again, this time of death chilling you to the bone. You prayed it wouldn't be you, not tonight. You held your breath and listened for the telltale call. But there were so many nights, so many prayers. Later, when the cholera was finally spent and the train moved on, you wondered, who were they? Where had they come from? What had happened to them? And then you remembered. You all had started out together, all hopeful and full of dreams. You had been strong then. You had been healthy. And then the sickness took them. How could you forget? The faces were gone, but the fear remained. When the snow closed in, you had to go fast. There was no other way. All the way from Independence, Missouri, to Oregon City, Oregon, it was over 2,000 miles. Most traveled by wagon, though some walked or rode horses. To cover that distance, it took months. For most of the year, the trip was pleasant. Days were long and hot, but evenings were cool. Nights were even cooler, perfect for sleeping under a blanket of stars. Summers were warm, winters were mild. Spring brought wildflowers and new life. Fall brought ripe berries and crisp air. Winter brought problems, lots of problems. It was hard enough keeping a wagon on the right track. It was harder when snow piled high and hid the road. It was nearly impossible when you had to trudge through knee-deep snow and couldn't see the wagon wheels churning in the mud. It was deadly, it was slow, and it was freezing. So people hurried. Everyone did. The race wasn't just to reach Oregon, it was to outrun winter. You pushed your oxen or mules ahead of you. The trail was rough. Your wagon bounced and jostled. There was no road, there was only the trail. And everyone pressed forward, trying to stay on it. Sometimes the trail was lost entirely. The river shifted course, covering up the tracks. Travel became nearly impossible. Storms struck suddenly, rattling your world, rocking your wagon, snapping branches, tearing down trees. Thunder boomed, lightning cracked, rain poured, hail fell. Sometimes it seemed as if the entire mountain was rumbling and shaking. Once the storm passed, you stood amidst the wreckage, assessing the damage. A broken wagon wheel, a leaky barrel, a torn canvas, a shattered spirit. You made repairs with wood and rope and hide, and you hoped it would last another day. Because every day that you broke down, you fell further behind. And if you got too far behind, you risked being trapped on the wrong side of a pass when the snow fell. And if you were trapped, you froze, you woke in the morning and thought, let's go back home. You knew you could do it. The land here is good. You could farm it. You could hunt it. You could live off the fat of the buffalo until spring. It would be easy to stay. You just needed to put down your shovel. You can stay here. No one would know you abandoned your wagon train. You could disappear into the hills and become one with the Indians. After all, they had lived here a long time and never complained about the cold. No one would know except the ghosts. You imagine their gaunt faces peering at you from the underbrush, their empty sockets boring into your soul, their skeletal fingers scratching at your door. You couldn't stay. You had to go on. You packed up quickly. You didn't want to spend another night here. You climbed into your wagon and you kept going. You raced across the plains, racing against the storm, racing against the chill. But there was no victory. The mountains always won. They were ancient. They were massive. They were full of hidden passes and blind curves. You rounded a bend and the wind tore at you, biting at your face. You huddled deeper into your blanket, pulling it tight, wrapping it close, praying you wouldn't freeze. You could feel the temperature changing. You could see the light fading. You knew the storm was coming, so you pushed on, and then you saw it. The first flakes floating down from the darkening sky. You hurried faster. You couldn't let the storm catch you. You couldn't let it freeze you. You couldn't let it kill you. And then you ran. You ran through the snow, up the mountain, away from the storm, desperate to reach the top before the blizzard buried you alive. And you made it. You reached the pass and looked back. And below you, the storm raged, but above you, the sky was clear. Oregon, land of sunshine, fresh fruit, milk, and honey. Okay, maybe not that last part, but for thousands of settlers in the mid-1800s, Oregon was their promised land. They just had to get there first. Here are the top 3 things that broke pioneer families on their way to Oregon. Number 1, some wagon trains split up. The stronger, faster families pushed ahead. Others stayed behind, tending to a sick child, fixing a broken axle, resting exhausted animals. Many hoped to catch up. Some never did. It was common to see abandoned wagons in the final 100 miles, left behind like grave markers on the side of the trail. Every one of them told a story you didn't want to hear. This is the story of one such family, the 16-year-old daughter of pioneers George and Marion Elliott. She was born in Illinois and grew up hearing her father's tales of the wild frontier. George himself had been born in Kentucky, but he spent most of his life in Ohio. But those stories and that life weren't enough for him. So when the call of adventure came again, he packed his bags and moved west with his wife and 5 children. In 1847, thousands of settlers headed out on the Oregon Trail. This time, however, would prove harder than normal. Winter had come early and the weather turned out bad. While most of the wagon trains made good time, the Elliots fell behind. And while everyone in the train tried to help each other, there were only so many ways they could slow down for lagging families without slowing down too much themselves. Eventually, the decision was made for the Elliots to stay behind for the winter and catch up in the spring. So they set up camp at Independence Rock. The daughter, Eliza, wrote about what happened next in her diary. We pitched our tent on the bank of the Sweetwater River. Our father cut down wood and built us a good fire. He was busy all day, and Mother and our eldest brother David assisted him. Father went out hunting, expecting to find plenty of game. His gun was large and heavy, and as he is strong and active, he soon overtook us. He returned in the evening with a fat goose, which we all enjoyed. Life wasn't hard, she wrote, but it was lonely. There were no neighbors. Her father hunted and fished, her mother sewed, and the children read by the light of the fire. In the daytime, her brother helped their father work on the wagon. And every day they talked about how nice it would be to see other people. Then, one day, they saw smoke on the hill above them. They waved a handkerchief. The other party waved back, and soon they were having tea together. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. S. Foster, and their 4 children. They had been on the trail for 6 months, and while they were excited to see another family, they learned something. The Fosters had traveled 1,200 miles and covered 180 in the past 2 days alone. And the Elliots realized they were going to have a long wait before they saw anyone else. The Fosters warned them that if they were planning on traveling with the main wagon train, they should leave right away. And now, feeling a little guilty about their leisurely pace, the Elliots said goodbye and got back to work. 3 weeks later, they finally saw more smoke. Soon, 3 men and 2 women stood around their campfire. The travelers gave them news from the outside world and told them the nearest trading post was 50 miles away. The Elliots asked if they could go with them, but their answer was firm, no. As they watched the strangers leave, the Elliots began to worry. What if they were robbed? What if their supplies ran low? Would their children die before anyone found them? As weeks passed and no one came, Eliza's fears became reality. Flour ran out. Then the meat began to spoil. Finally, rations ran out altogether. Then their 2-year-old son died. Eliza remembered writing in her diary, "We buried him near the rock and piled stones over his grave. None of us could shed a tear. Grief had frozen us all." After a while, George Eliot decided to send his 12-year-old daughter Eliza and a friend on foot to the trading post 50 miles away to get help. But when Eliza and her friend arrived, they were shocked. The fort was gone. It had been robbed by Indians. And realizing they had no choice, the 2 girls started walking back home. When they arrived, the family ate the small amount of food remaining and prepared for the worst. When help didn't arrive after a week, George Eliot got in his wagon and drove off to find it. 5 days later, he returned, leading a rescue team. They dug up their dead son and put him in a coffin. But their troubles weren't over yet. Within a few days, Eliza fell ill. She spent a week unconscious before dying. Her brother David was the only survivor. Most of the wagon trains that year made it to Oregon, but the Elliots didn't. Some families did make it, like the Bybee family, who managed the journey in 91 days. But for others, the trip took so long that new trails had to be carved out because the snow had melted. Pioneers traveling west continued to face terrible hardships even after reaching Oregon. That's why you see so many abandoned wagons along the Columbia River, just 100 miles from the end of the trail. Up next, No. 2, when animals collapsed. For most of the trip, the oxen had pulled the wagon through heat, rain, snowstorms, up hills, through valleys. By this point, many were barely walking. Their ribs showed through their skin. Their legs trembled. Their eyes were dull. When an ox collapsed, there were few choices. Try to revive it with water and time, both precious resources. Butcher it for meat, though the idea felt like betrayal. Abandon it and move on with fewer animals to pull the load. Some families did all three. One diary entry reads, "The most heart-rending scenes that can possibly be imagined are the sight of an ox, exhausted and famishing, dragging its weary limbs along and falling down, and then rising again and again till it has scarcely strength enough to rise, and dragged on by the hope of obtaining a mouthful of the sweet, juicy grass which grows luxuriantly along the banks of the river. The poor beast continues its march until it falls down and dies." One traveler, J.C. Stewart, killed an ox and prepared it for eating, but not before saying, "I cannot eat beef." I said, "But now I will eat anything to sustain my strength." I cut into the ribs and lapped up the bloodworm. Never did any dish taste so good, but this, too, was hard to endure. The smell of a dead animal rotting in the sun is hard to forget. Plus, the work was never done. As more oxen fell, the group had to keep moving. Once they stopped, things got even worse. Winter approached fast and the ground froze. If they wanted to eat, they had to keep moving. Along with hunger and exhaustion, settlers faced the constant threat of attack from Native Americans. With fewer oxen to defend them, they were more vulnerable than ever. The biggest threat might have been the sound of an animal groaning in the cold, left behind in the snow. That sound followed pioneers the rest of their lives. Next, number 3, water grew scarce. You'd think being near Oregon meant rivers and fresh water. But as winter crept closer, streams froze, water barrels ran low. Ice had to be broken with axes, gathered in buckets, melted over the fire, which meant burning the last of your firewood. Even then, water was often murky, filled with silt. As the journey wore on, travelers found themselves taking risks they never imagined they would. Some drank from pools shared by animals. Some boiled water, hoping to kill bacteria. One man wrote, "The only water we could find was in the heads of dead animals left by the road and soaked in the rain. The first swallowings brought a disagreeable taste, but we found no other, and so we drank on. Even still, cholera and typhoid fever spread among the settlers. Children died. Whole wagon trains sometimes perished. For most, drinking the impure water was worth the risk. Not all pioneers died on the Oregon Trail, but those who did were often forgotten. There wasn't always time to bury them properly, and their graves were often lost or destroyed. A photographer traveling through in the 1860s wrote that he often came across skeletons on the trail. He even photographed a few. Some pioneers' remains were lost to the elements, picked clean by vultures. Others were simply left in their wagons, buried beneath the floorboards when the wagon was abandoned. Still others were left on display for years, hanging from trees or stuck in rocks. Most gruesome of all, some were chopped up and their bones scattered by the wind. It's hard to imagine now, but only about 150 years ago, people really did travel by horse-drawn wagon across half a continent. And the difficulties they faced, finding food, clean water, rest stops, are not unlike the difficulties travelers face today, except now the journey takes a matter of days instead of months. Thanks for watching. Do you know any crazy travel stories from history? Share them below. In the beginning, there were dreams of a new life, of farmsteads and gold mines and fortunes to be made. In the beginning, there was hope. Hope for adventure, for freedom, for a better world just beyond the next hill. But then something happened. Something happened to the pioneers that turned their eyes dull and their steps slow. Something that ate away at their minds as surely as the elements wore down their bodies. What happened on the Oregon Trail? What happened to those hardy souls who set out across the continent seeking new lives? What happened to them? For most, the first challenge was simply staying alive. Days bled into weeks and the food supply dwindled. Rations became smaller, meals less frequent. You went from eating 3 times a day to once. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at your belly, making every step harder than the last. If you complained about being hungry, a grim joke circulated among the travelers. It went like this. First, your back is aching from carrying your weight. Then your legs are aching from walking all day. Then you're too hungry to do either. That was how it went. But even that was nothing compared to what came next. Because along the Oregon Trail, thirst crept in silently. Not the searing thirst of a desert, but the slow, creeping kind that made your mouth dry and your mind sluggish. At first, there were streams. Plenty of places along the river where you could fill up your canteen, cook some beans, maybe catch a fish for dinner. But as you pushed further west, water became harder to find. Soon, you were rationing what little you could carry. When the sun beat down mercilessly on the prairie, each man, woman, and child drank their fill and waited for the next supply of water, which might be hours or days away. Then there was the dust. Rolling plains choked the air, seeped into your clothes, and clung to your skin. Each grain of sand an abrasive reminder of the precious liquid you lacked. You dreamed of water. You woke up thirsty. You reached out for water and grasped only air. The taste of water lingered on your lips, mocking you. The need for water was constant, unending. Some tried to ignore it. They strapped their canteens to their backs and kept walking, figuring they could drink when they stopped for the night. But their bodies soon forced them to turn back. It wasn't worth dying of thirst. Most travelers abandoned their wagons at Independence Rock because they couldn't pull any further. All that rock and dust made it hard to breathe, harder still to move. A few people died right there, their bodies buried beneath the very earth they'd traveled so far to escape. Those who survived struggled on, some on foot, others in wagons that bumped and rattled over the uneven ground. Eventually, the rocky terrain gave way to a muddy mess. The oxen pulled and slipped. The wheels sank deeper and deeper into the sucking mud. Soon, it seemed like the entire world was a sea of mud. Your wagon was stuck. You looked around. Everyone else was stuck too. And the rain fell day after day, soaking you to the bone and adding more mud to the growing pile. And then, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, the fever came. Few things in life are as miserable as a traveler with a fever. You were burning up inside, but every drop of water you drank made you shake and shiver uncontrollably. If you were alone, you were on your own. No one would know if you died of thirst, exhaustion, or fever. But if you were part of a company, your fellow travelers might take care of you. Sometimes, for some, that meant carrying you on their backs or tying you to the back of their wagon. For others, it meant leaving you behind, hoping you'd die quickly so they could keep moving before disease took the rest of them. There was no middle ground. On the Oregon Trail, you were either 100% useful or 100% dead weight. If you managed to avoid all these dangers and still survived, well, then you had to worry about what happened to your feet. Many pioneers had walked 1,500 to 2,000 miles by now. Their boots were worn to shreds. Some wrapped their feet in rags. Others walked barefoot on frozen ground. Blisters turned to infections. Toes turned purple, skin cracked. Every step burned. There was no break, no rescue wagon, no footrest waiting at camp. You limped or you were left behind. But even if you managed to survive the entire journey without dying of thirst, starvation, fever, or losing your feet, that didn't mean you were out of the woods yet. Because along the Oregon Trail, time played tricks on your mind. With hunger, cold, and exhaustion, a hallucination could strike at any time. Some pioneers reported seeing lights in the distance that weren't really there, like houses or campfires that flickered and vanished when approached. Others swore they saw ghosts, relatives they'd lost earlier on the trail, or even specters walking beside them who disappeared when touched. When your mind is weakened by suffering, it begins to dream while still awake, but you had to keep walking. It was hundreds of miles from Fort Laramie to Fort Vancouver, and most travelers refused to stop until they reached the safety of a trading post. Hallucinations, Fever River, mud, starvation, thirst, even death itself couldn't stop them. They pressed on, driven by the dream of a lush valley waiting for them just beyond the next ridge. And then suddenly it was there. The valley suddenly, the steep trail did. The trees thinned, and there it was, the Willamette Valley. Lush, green, quiet, real. Some cried, some collapsed. Some stared, numb, too tired to feel anything. They had made it, but it had taken everything they had. Now, surviving the Oregon Trail wasn't easy. Your body would be battered and bruised, your mind broken and exhausted. When you arrived in the Willamette Valley, you might have been too weak to set up camp or start a fire. Luckily, the U.S. government was there to help ease your transition to Oregon territory. Not exactly. The government had established several relief stations to hand out food, supplies, and medical care to the weary travelers. Relief stations were supposed to be like Shangri-La, peaceful havens where you could rest and recover before continuing your journey. Except they weren't. They were overcrowded, undersupplied, and rife with disease. But even if you managed to stay healthy and find food and shelter at one of these relief stations, the U.S. government still wasn't there to help. Most relief stations charged travelers for their supplies and medical care. Others outright refused to help anyone who didn't have the money to pay for services. And if you couldn't pay, well, there was always the work detail. The army in charge of the relief station might force able-bodied men to cook meals, chop wood, or guard the facility in exchange for their food and supplies. Women and children were expected to clean up the camp and take care of the sick, which often involved handling corpses. Travelers who refused to work were often denied supplies and left to fend for themselves. At some relief stations, the work detail was a death sentence. People assigned to guard the storehouses or mills sometimes got locked in overnight. No one knew how many people died of starvation or, well, other causes. Some relief stations were little more than glorified prisons. If you managed to leave the facility alive, you still had to deal with whatever you used to barter for your supplies. One traveler described the scene at a relief station vividly. It was like a bar room in San Francisco, he wrote, except that here, instead of whiskey, flour, and sugar was the coin. In fact, the army ran the place like a gambling hall. Lucky ones got their baits right and drew good rations. Unlucky ones got the weevil-infested flour and the sawdust biscuits. Once you received your supplies, you were on your own again. The final leg of the Oregon Trail was marked by more hardships. Travelers struggled to plant crops and build homes in an area where the winters were long and brutal and the land was still occupied by Native Americans. Settlers who didn't know how to farm or hunt or fish often starved during their first winter. Those who didn't know how to live off the land found themselves attacked by people who did. It was a struggle to survive, but somehow they made it work. Today, all that remains of the Oregon Trail are a few crumbling buildings and the memories of those who traveled it. But the story of the Oregon Trail isn't over. In fact, it has continued in the hearts and minds of those who dared to dream of a better life on the frontier. Do you think you could have survived the Oregon Trail? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales.